Shalom, welcome again to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Thank you for joining us. I am your host, Rabbi Richard Address. And if you'd like to contact us, just drop me an email at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. That's the website, jewishsacredaging.com, and we're on Facebook. Well, the usual suspects, and we look forward to hearing from you and welcome your comments and suggestions. Novels are a great art form, and they speak to so many levels of reality and what people are writing about and why they're writing about. And we are very, very honored and privileged to have a novelist with us right now for today's edition of Seekers of Meaning. And we welcome Barbara Viniar, who is the author of this lovely little book called Little Bird. So Barbara, welcome. You're coming to us from that haven known as the Berkshires, right?
I am.
Little enclave of civilization in Western Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hang out at Tanglewood a lot?
Several times a week.
Yeah, it's okay. That's like a cultural phenomenon in Western Massachusetts during the summertime. I was there once. It's magnificent, but I have tons of friends who go there regularly. Little Bird, a very, very fascinating, interesting novel. What made you write this? Is this grandmom? Is this your grandmother?
It is, in the sense that my grandmother was a 16-year-old girl who was brought here for what we believe was an arranged marriage. I did not know that growing up. In fact, I didn't know it until a few years ago. My cousin sent me a picture of my grandparents, very romantic picture. I said to her, I don't remember our grandparents being that affectionate. She said, that's not our grandfather. I was rather shocked, and it made me hire a genealogist to find out if it wasn't my grandfather, who was it? And why was she sitting on that park bench with him? The genealogist actually found where my grandmother was born, when she got to this country, the ship she came on, how much money they had, because they had to have $25 to get into the country, and the family that they were going to that we think were cousins. Within 6 months, she was married to the son in that family. It was a very wealthy family. They had a factory. They had a patent. Now you know everything I know factually about my grandmother. Oh, I do know that she got a divorce and married the man who was my grandfather. That's all I knew. And I honestly can't tell you when I decided to write a book, but after I got that picture, I started to write some short things, an essay, a blog post, entries in my journal, which I looked up to prepare to talk to you, and discovered that my journal entries have meticulous dates, but no years. So I don't actually know when I was thinking about this. But I do know that when the research was completed, I said, I need to tell my grandmother's story. Even though I won't know if it's factual, it will be the truth that I understand about my grandmother, and also, Rabbi, to a degree about myself, that it's my story too. The story of a girl who did what she was supposed to do and then changed her life, turned her life in another direction. So I think it's my grandmother's voice to the degree that I could imagine it, and it's my voice. And that's what made me do it.
I wanted to start off with that question because writing fiction, my sense is, especially in a story like this, it's hard to divorce yourself, some part of your own neshama, from really what goes on the pages of your novel. And Fanny, whose name was Fagel in the beginning, her own little arc. First of all, to be divorced in the 1930s, 1920s, in the Jewish community, this is not something regular. It's not like today where 50% of the marriages may end in divorce. Her arc of her life really reflects so much. But one of the most interesting things you just said is the arc of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about that.
Well, even though my grandmother was 16, 17 when she came here in 1910 and when she got married, and we come from different almost centuries, I feel like I had a lot in common. And New York and my growing up was probably closer to hers in some way than it is to my grandchildren. Yes, they were just starting to have telephones and cars and things. And yet hers is a world that I knew about. And I heard my parents and my grandparents speak Yiddish. I knew about the Lower East Side. I just knew about the Jewish culture. And yet I see such a difference now. So I grew up in her culture. I grew up knowing her. I grew up spending weekends without my younger brothers, which was being treated like a princess. So I loved my grandmother, but I had no idea who she was. And so I kind of felt that I could imagine who she was in part by imagining who I was. And the voice came, I'm not going to say easily. It took a while to write this book, but it wasn't as challenging as if I were just writing about a stranger or a real historical figure. I felt I did have an intimacy there that I could capture. And I love doing it.
My sense is your grandmother's very, very much with you.
Yes. As I was writing the book, I conversed with my grandmother and I constantly was saying, I hope this is okay. Especially there are some scenes in there about her first sexual experience and her sexual awakening. And clearly that's not anything I knew or discussed with my grandmother. And I kept saying, Grandma, I hope this is okay. I hope this is you. I hope that you're not going to be embarrassed.
Barbara, did you get an answer?
Actually, my grandmother did not speak to me during this process, but there is a character in the book who was not part of my thinking when I had my original outline, and he spoke without my knowing it.
Wow.
So when she's on the ship and she's up on deck and she's looking for her father, she's standing at the railing and this young man next to her says, "Where's a pretty girl like you going?" Until I typed those words, I didn't know they were coming. I always thought that was weird when other authors told me that, but that was my experience, that he just showed up and took her story in a whole other direction.
Yes, but more about that later.
Okay.
She changes her name for business reasons. Very meaningful and historically accurate for a lot of immigrants. And you talk about that in the book.
Yes.
I mean, walk me through that a little bit.
Well, it's actually her husband who demands that she change her name because he's been in America for a long time. All his friends speak English. And he literally says to her, with a name like that, everyone will know you just came off the boat. She's not happy, but she feels obligated to do what her husband tells her to do. Her father is very angry. He said, but we gave her this name. I went to the temple and announced her name, and she's named after my grandmother. And she says, but Papa, you brought me up to be a traditional wife, and I'm doing what I need to do. As the book progressed, she truly does become Fanny. You know, that's the name she's given. And I thought about going back to Fega when she leaves her husband, but by then she's really Fanny. And that's how I knew her. I never knew her name was Fega. I knew her as Fanny.
Fanny.
Mm-hmm.
And she was in business.
No, her husband was in business.
No, but she
eventually goes to work as a seamstress and makes a living from her embroidery.
You could look at this also as a little lesson in immigrant history, but I think you can also look at it from a feminist perspective as the arc of the transformation of the role of a woman in the 20th century of the United States of America, especially from the immigrant population, of how that really emerged. Because Fanny, at the end of this novel, Little Bird, is in many ways, not all, obviously not the woman who walked off the boat in the island. Talk to me about how your thought process worked in creating this arc of change in the transformation of this woman who goes through a divorce, very rare. Just, can you walk us through that?
That may be the part that's most reflective of me. You know, the move toward independence. I did see it in my grandmother. I wouldn't call my grandmother a feminist, but I'll give you one example that I'm actually wearing. So I'm wearing a diamond heart that my grandmother gave me, and she gave it to me when my grandfather died. My grandfather left each of his grandchildren a small amount of money, but he left my brother, who's younger than I am, more money because he was the oldest grandson. I was the oldest grandchild. He was the oldest grandson. So he got, I think it was an extra $1,000. And my grandmother called me into her room and said, that is not right. And I'm going to make it right. And she gave me this heart, which my grandfather had given her, which I actually put in the book as I imagine the scene. That was her way of saying, I don't believe that just because he's a boy, he deserves more than you. So she had her moments. And I also remember that she let women say Kaddish for my grandfather. And my grandfather never would have allowed that, but she did. So I think there were parts of her that was probably there all along, but I didn't see it. Only when he died did I see some of that get verbalized and made obvious.
Again, we're speaking with Barbara Viniar, the author of this very delightful novel, Little Bird. Barbara, let's get this out of the way. This is available through the usual sources.
Absolutely. It's on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. It's out there.
I'm reading the book. I'm picturing the Netflix miniseries.
I believe the expression is from your mouth to God's ears.
Yes. And she hasn't been listening lately. I'm fascinated because we talk to a lot of authors, and I'm just fascinated by the creative process of what it means to sit your tushy down on a chair, look at a screen or a piece of paper, and out of your own experience and your neshama, you create a world. You created a world here. There may be one or two people who, where you were a couple of years ago and saying, I have this story in me. I just don't know how to get it out. What would you say to these people?
Sort of what you just said, but in chair, sit and write. I took some steps that were much more concrete than that. I had taken a class called Writing Your COVID Memoir. Out of that class, a bunch of us stayed together as a writing group. And I had always written blog posts and haikus and other kinds of things. I was an academic, so I wrote a lot of academic articles. I just had never written fiction. So one of the first things I did was call a novelist that I knew and said, help me. And she was my what's called developmental editor. And I would every 2 weeks send her something and she would give me some feedback. And I read a lot. I read books on writing from even Stephen King. Many authors have books, and it all boils down to sit down and write. But I looked at articles on character development and using all your senses. So I did try and teach myself some of that, but the story, no one can make up your story. And so that partly I knew ahead of time and partly happened as I was writing. One thing I did know from the very beginning, I have my grandmother's candlesticks, and I had them from the moment that she died. I watched her growing up, light the candles in them. And two things I found out about them. One, they were broken. They were welded, and I had no idea why. I mean, broken candlesticks? That seemed kind of odd. And I knew somehow that was going to be the central turning point in that novel, that the candlesticks would get broken and that would have a meaning. And actually, when I started to write, I took the candlesticks into a jeweler because I didn't even know if they came from this country or they were brought over. And I thought maybe he could help because it was looked like a trademark. He said to me, can you read Hebrew? I said, well, I read the letters, but I don't always know what the words are. He said, well, there's an inscription on the base of this candlestick. I had had these candlesticks for years. I never knew. So I actually took them to a Thanksgiving dinner, and my brother Carl and everyone there helped translate. And I found out that these candlesticks were a gift from her mother. At the beginning, I only knew they would be in the story. But as I was writing and finding things out, I figured out how to make them part of the story. I did a lot of research for the context, and sometimes that just gave me something to write about. I discovered there was a terrible heat wave in 1911. It killed thousands of people. This is before air conditioning. Babies in tenements died because there was no air. People jumped into the East River. I put it in the book. Her father comes to see her and she has an electric fan because they had a lot of money and they could afford one. And he comes in and he's hot that he even takes his hat off and his coat. And so in doing the research, I found things that I could integrate into what you're calling the story arc. And they were more factual and I think for me made it interesting to write.
You taught women's studies, and about 8 minutes ago said that Fanny really wasn't a feminist. But the reality is, in her arc, in the flow of that story, does she become, if not the word feminist in the 21st century concept, she becomes a very powerful, assured woman, correct?
Absolutely. She has decided to live life on her own terms. I mean, the fact that she leaves her husband and is willing to take on family, friends, societal expectations because he's cruel and she doesn't want to live like that. She does that. She gets a job by literally pushing open a door.
Correct.
When the employer says, "Oh, not interested," she sticks her foot in the door and says, "Oh, wait, look at this." And she gets a job. She loves her job. It gives her a measure of independence. And when she meets Jacob, the man who she eventually marries, she's indecisive at first. She's like, well, yeah, he's really nice and I enjoy being with him, but I like being independent. So there's significant growth. I think she also sees in the world around her younger women who have choices, like her sister-in-law, who, by the way, is completely fabricated, but her sister-in-law is a nurse. She said, well, she has a choice that I never had. When her younger sister comes over, and that is true, by the way, her father did go back to Russia and bring the rest of the family. Her younger sister is immediately engaged with the sister-in-law. Wow, I could be a nurse. And Fanny's angry about that. How come I didn't have a choice? They brought me over here. They married me off. I didn't even have a say over my name. I didn't have a say over when I was getting married. I didn't have a say about school, and I deserve a say. So in that sense, a sense of embracing independence, she's a feminist.
Yes. You can't help but get that as you read through the book. This is also a historical novel.
Yes.
And as you just pointed out, the generational changes between then and, let's say, 21st century American Jewish families. What have we lost? What have we gained?
Well, I think we've gained families being together. Although in my own family, we live close enough to go to my grandparents' house every Friday night for dinner, or most Friday nights. But my mother's family moved to California, so I didn't know those grandparents very well. So I can't say that we all lived in the same shtetl or New York neighborhood and grew up, but we had a closeness that I don't think we have anymore. Kids grow up, they move away. My own children live in Florida. My grandchildren have scattered. So I think we've lost that. And we've lost, I think, a sense of Judaism being central to our life. Not maybe the religious observances, but just the sense, the identity, who we are. And I'm not sure that my grandchildren have that in the way that I had it. And certainly that was enforced by living in a Jewish neighborhood, going to school with Jewish kids. I think that's very different now. And that's a loss. We've gained the ability to interact with Jews who are different. Like in my congregation, we have Jews of color and Sephardic Jews. It makes a difference in my life to have that breadth of experience. We also have the ability to travel and go to Israel in the way my grandparents never did. We have the technology and the ability to do research that enabled me to find out about my grandmother.
Right.
And I'm betting that many people watching this have family secrets or family history that they don't know that is so much easier to find out now. Although you still can't have those conversations. And in part, I wrote this book. I wanted my grandchildren to read this book and have their history the way I created it.
Have they read it?
Yes.
And what did they?
No, they didn't say very much.
Really?
Yeah. I think they're very proud of me, but they didn't say very much about the book itself.
So you have two other very interesting male characters, excluding the first husband who was abusive. Samuel and Jacob. And you alluded to the boat, come here often, which, in that context, it's an interesting pickup line on the middle of the ship and coming from Europe, But he resurfaces, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
At a very interesting moment, they're going to hook up, you cue the violins right out of a Hallmark movie. And then what happens?
He betrays her. He lies. And she does think that he's the love of her life. And in fact, he says to her, "You're the love of my life," but he's engaged to somebody else. And her friends say, "Hey, look, this is what men do." So he said, "Please forgive him." And he's willing to leave his fiance. In the sense, they're saying, "Get over it." And she said, "No, I don't want to be with him. He betrayed me and I don't have to forgive him." And that's another example of feminism. Of women don't have to forgive what people will say, "Oh, boys will be boys."
Right.
And she said, no. She said, "I'm going to go it alone." And she's devastated. I mean, absolutely devastated. And then she meets Jacob, and he's charming. I have to tell you, my original plan was that she would meet Jacob, who was, in fact, the brother of her schoolmate, and she would eventually marry him because she had to. She was 20 something. She wanted to have children, and she might be a feminist, but this is not something you do alone. And I saw it sort of as a marriage of convenience. And in my original outline of the book, that's the way it ends. But you know what? Somewhere along the way, I fell in love with Fanny. I thought, I like this spunky woman, and I'm going to give her a happy ending. So when she meets Jacob, who is good looking and educated and interested in exploring things and not judgmental, except maybe where it comes to religion, she does fall in love, and she ends up saying yes to him, that she does want to marry him. She's not settling. She's deciding. That was kind of a surprise too. That's not how I ever thought of my grandfather, who, when I knew him, I thought he was a little old bald man with a hearing aid. I have a picture of him from his World War II days, and he was very good looking. And I wanted it to be a real love affair. So that's how Jacob evolved.
The book ends with the birth of a son.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the rabbi, says, my God, very Christological, final fade to black, they're holding the baby. She's holding the baby. The baby reaches out. They grab their hands. The end. Okay. What's that symbolize?
Well, for her, it was the happiness she always wanted. She wanted a child. She had a very loving mother herself, and that was something that meant fulfillment for her. And as a couple, it was fulfillment for them. This is World War I. It represents a future. And for me, it was the happy ending. And it also happens to be my father, and it's my next book.
Uh-huh.
Not exactly a sequel, but he will be the hero of the next book.
He being
my father.
Your father.
So the characters like Fanny and Jacob and her brothers and sister-in-laws, they will show up again, but it's not meant to tie up the loose ends of who they were and what their history is. But I have started writing it, and I'm sort of in the same place. I know some facts about my father. I know stories that he told, some of which may be true. When I talk to my brother, he'll say, "Oh, but Dad told me." I'm like, "Really? He never told me." I'm sort of gathering some of the family lore and also some of the actual history of his service in World War II. So I'm excited. I have some trepidation because, as we've talked, I could write about Fanny because she was me. I can't write about my father that way. I was never a young man serving in the military. There's so many parts of his experience that are not mine that it's a very different voice. So it's really a challenge, but I've started, and I think I always knew when the book ended, that's my father. And I wasn't sure where I would go with it, but it had meaning for me, even if nobody who reads the book knows that.
Wow. Well, thanks for the breaking news. Little Bird by Barbara Viniar. It's just a delightful read, and I think you'll learn a lot. What have imagine that there are many people of a certain generation who will find much in here to identify with. So I wish you just, first of all, health.
Thank you.
And then continued success. And do you have a sense? I know this is a silly question. Do you have a sense of when part 2 will be available?
I'm just getting started. It took me 3 years to write Little Bird, so you'll have to wait. And so
Okay.
will I. And so will I.
That's a great answer. Don't worry. Listen, Barbara, thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Enjoy Tanglewood and just stay healthy and continued success. Take care. Thank you very much. To all of you, thank you very much for joining us on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Visit the website, jewishsacredaging.com, to sort of like understand all the stuff that we're involved with, people writing for it. If you like to write for the website, please feel free to accept this invitation to do so. There's also a conveniently located donate button on the website, so if you'd like to support these programs, just follow the prompts. We really do appreciate it. If you'd like to become a sponsor of some of these programs, again, just email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. These programs are produced at the studios of Lubetkin Media in beautiful Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and a big shout out to our tech genius, Steve Lubetkin. Until we see each other again on the next Seekers of Meaning, I want to thank you very, very much for the gift of your time and ask you just be kind to one another. Take care. Shalom.